On October 14, 2026, the Boeing Company filed a Form 8K with the Securities and Exchange Commission announcing the permanent relocation of its remaining corporate functions out of its Chicago headquarters and into its Arlington, Virginia campus. 20 years of continuous corporate presence in the Fulton-Randolph corridor gone, and the state of Illinois just lost the anchor tenant of its single most ambitious corporate recruitment in modern history, along with an estimated $76 billion in associated economic relationships that had been quietly built around that anchor over 2 decades. Now I have watched a lot of corporations move in my 95 years on this earth. I have watched headquarters open in places nobody believed could attract them and close in places that gave away the farm to land them. I have watched governors stand at podiums and promise that the next big relocation was just a tax credit away. But what just happened between Boeing and the state of Illinois is something I want to walk you through carefully, because this is not a story about an aerospace company moving 400 executives from one address to another. This is a story about a state that paid handsomely to acquire a trophy, watched the trophy lose its shine in real time, listened to its own civic leadership, described the deterioration on public record, and is now staring at a vacated tower on West Fulton Market, wondering how the original arithmetic ever worked. And the people paying for that empty tower are not Boeing shareholders. They are the working families across Cook County who never had the option to leave. I have been sitting in the same office in Omaha, Nebraska for over 50 years, same desk, same chair, same view of a parking lot. That has not meaningfully changed since the Ford administration. I drink about 5 cherry Cokes a day, and I have been doing that long enough that my assistant stopped asking what I wanted in the morning sometime around the second Reagan term. I still live in the house I bought in 1958 for $31,500, and every single morning I show up to that office because there is nothing on this earth I would rather be doing. People ask me all the time why I never moved Berkshire Hathaway to Chicago or New York or anywhere else with more glamour, and I always give them the same answer: because the business I was building did not care what zip code I was sitting in. The numbers worked in Omaha, so I stayed in Omaha. Boeing kept its headquarters in Chicago for 20 years for exactly the same reason. The numbers worked, and then they stopped working. And the moment they stopped, the company did what any rational corporation does when the arithmetic changes. It followed the math. Now, let me tell you how a company founded in a Seattle boathouse in 1916 became one of the most consequential industrial enterprises on this continent. Boeing did not become Boeing by accident. It became Boeing by building the airplanes that connected the world, and for most of the 20th century, the company was synonymous with the city of Seattle. Then, in May of 2001, after a quiet competition among Chicago, Dallas, and Denver, Boeing announced it would move its corporate headquarters to Chicago. Mayor Richard M. Daley flew to a Lamont airfield to greet the corporate jet personally. The state of Illinois, the city of Chicago, and Cook County collectively committed approximately $63 million in tax incentives, relocation grants, and property tax abatements to land the company. The deal was, at the time, the largest corporate recruitment in Illinois history. Boeing was not just a tenant in Chicago. It was the validation of a thesis that the city was a credible home for global corporate headquarters. At its peak, the Chicago office housed roughly 500 executives and supported thousands of additional jobs across the city's legal, financial, accounting, consulting, and aviation services sectors. The aggregate economic relationship between Boeing and the greater Chicago region, including direct headquarters spending, supplier contracts, philanthropic giving, and the corporate gravitational pull on adjacent firms, was estimated in a 2019 World Business Chicago report at approximately $76 billion over the duration of the company's residency, and Illinois had 20 years to understand exactly what that anchor represented. Now, I want you to pay close attention to what happened next, because this is where my partner Charlie Munger's most important lesson becomes impossible to ignore. Charlie used to say, "Show me the incentive and I will show you the outcome." Always the incentives. Not the intentions, not the ribbon cuttings, not the speeches at the Economic Club of Chicago, the incentives. So let us look honestly at the incentive structure Illinois constructed for its largest corporate tenant over the second decade of that 20-year residency. And let me be clear at the outset, the people who built this structure were not bad people. They were responding to genuine fiscal pressure, a pension system that had been underfunded for 40 years, a property tax base that had eroded as residents moved to the suburbs, and public safety concerns that were entirely legitimate. I understand every one of those pressures. The concerns were real. But over a period stretching from roughly 2017 through 2026, Illinois assembled a stack of conditions that, taken individually, each had a defensible rationale, and taken together produced a mathematical conclusion the General Assembly never quite stopped to calculate. There was the 2017 state income tax increase, raising the corporate rate to 7% from 5.25%. There was the city's 2020 imposition of a new lease transaction tax on high-end commercial occupancy in the Loop. There was the steady deterioration of the state's unfunded pension liability, which by the first quarter of 2026 stood at approximately $144 billion, the worst per capita figure in the country, casting a permanent shadow over the state's long-term tax trajectory. There was the rise in property tax assessments on Class A commercial buildings in the West Loop, which by 2025 were running roughly 38% higher than comparable assessments in Arlington, Virginia. And then there was the cumulative weight of the company's own situation. The 737 MAX groundings beginning in 2019, the door panel incident in January of 2024, and the increasing share of Boeing's commercial business that required direct, sustained contact with the Pentagon, the FAA, and congressional appropriators, every one of whom worked within roughly 15 miles of Arlington, Virginia. And then, in May of 2022, came the fatal detail. Boeing announced it would move its headquarters to Arlington. The Chicago tower on West Fulton Market was not immediately closed. Approximately 400 positions were to remain. The Illinois congressional delegation was assured the company would maintain a meaningful presence. But the signal had been sent, and anyone who has watched a corporate headquarters move knows what that signal means. The lease on the Chicago property was set to come up for renewal in late 2026. The capital required to renovate the existing space to current corporate standards was estimated in subsequent shareholder filings at approximately $47 million. The cost of a comparable consolidation into the existing Arlington campus, where the company had already invested significant capital, was estimated at less than $9 million. The math was not close. It was not even an interesting question. The window to act was not at the next lease renewal in 2031. The window was right now, while the corporate footprint could still be unwound on favorable terms, and the political cost of the move had already been absorbed by the 2022 announcement. Clear incentives produce predictable behavior every single time. What followed was not a single corporate decision made in isolation. It was a bank run. I want you to hold that image, because it is exactly right. When depositors believe a bank is about to fail, they do not wait politely for official confirmation. The ones who move first lose nothing. The ones who wait lose everything, so everyone moves first. That is the structure of what has been happening to Illinois corporate headquarters for the better part of a decade. The largest legacy employers in the state have been making the same simultaneous rational calculation Boeing just finalized, and they have been quietly withdrawing capital, withdrawing senior leadership, withdrawing forward commitments before the next fiscal window closes. And the Boeing announcement, when it came on October 14th, did not arrive alone. Caterpillar, founded in Illinois in 1925, moved its global headquarters from Deerfield to Irving, Texas in 2022. Citadel, the hedge fund built by Ken Griffin and for years the most valuable financial firm headquartered in Chicago, relocated to Miami in 2022. Tyson Foods consolidated its Chicago office back into Springdale, Arkansas. Highland Capital Brands moved to Florida. Sterigenics relocated its Willowbrook operations after regulatory pressure. Walgreens Boots Alliance, headquartered in Deerfield, announced a significant restructuring of its corporate footprint and store base. Conagra Brands, which had moved into the merchandise mart with great fanfare in 2016, began trimming its Chicago headcount in 2024. And now the corporate tenant that was the original validation of Chicago as a headquarters destination has filed its 8K to consolidate into Virginia. And in my experience, the names you can confirm publicly in any corporate migration are rarely the complete list. The estimated aggregate loss to Illinois from confirmed major headquarters relocations alone since 2020 exceeds $1.8 billion in annual state revenue. I want you to sit with that number for a moment. $1.8 billion. That single figure, the annual loss from confirmed departures, exceeds the entire annual budget of the Illinois State Police. Now, I am going to tell you about the moment in this story that I find the most extraordinary. The moment that, to my mind, defines this entire situation better than any 8K filing or relocation announcement possibly could. September 9th, 2026. The Economic Club of Chicago is hosting its fall luncheon at the Hilton on South Michigan Avenue. Governor J.B. Pritzker takes the stage for a moderated conversation on the state's fiscal trajectory. It is 35 days before Boeing's 8K is officially filed with the SEC, 35 days. And standing in front of an audience that included senior partners from every major law firm and consulting firm in the city, in a venue specifically associated with the validation of Chicago as a corporate capital, the governor of Illinois says, in his own words, that the state must, and I am paraphrasing from the published account of the remarks, confront the reality that the cumulative weight of its tax structure and its pension obligations has begun to affect the calculus of major employers, and that the state cannot continue to assume that legacy headquarters will remain legacy headquarters by virtue of habit alone. The sitting governor of Illinois on a stage on South Michigan Avenue 35 days before the largest corporate departure in the state's recent history was officially filed, describing with measured accuracy the precise mechanism of deterioration that was already executing while he stood there and spoke. I have been in business a long time. I have sat across the table from a lot of extraordinarily capable people, and I will tell you honestly, I cannot think of a parallel. A chief executive publicly describing the failure conditions of his own state's competitive position while the failure was already in motion, while the legislature he leads was simultaneously continuing to extend the structural conditions that made it inevitable. That is not contradiction. That is a governing situation so thoroughly documented in real time that it almost defies analysis. Now, step away from the executives in Arlington entirely for a moment. My father, Howard Buffett, was a congressman from Nebraska and a deeply principled man who taught me that the measure of any economic policy is never what it promises on the day it is announced. It is what it delivers to ordinary people living inside it 10 years later. So let me tell you about Diane Kowalski. Diane is 51 years old and has worked for 19 years as an executive assistant in the Boeing Chicago headquarters, supporting 2 senior vice presidents on the commercial aviation side. She lives in Mount Prospect with her husband, who is a journeyman electrician, and her son, who is in his 3rd year at the University of Illinois studying mechanical engineering. They bought their house in 2008 for $312,000, refinanced it in 2021 when rates dropped, and were on a schedule to have it paid off in 2033. The October announcement gives Diane and her colleagues the option to relocate to Arlington at company expense or accept a severance package that her HR representative estimated would cover, on average, between 5 and 8 months of household expenses for the affected employees. Diane will not be moving her family to Virginia. Her son's tuition arrangement, her husband's union local, her mother in Schaumburg who needs weekly help, none of that survives a relocation. The $76 billion in cumulative economic relationship that Boeing built with the Chicago region was not an abstraction to Diane. It was the difference between a son who finishes his engineering degree on schedule and one who has to take a semester off to work. It was the difference between a mortgage retired in 2033 and one that quietly slips into uncertainty. She did nothing to cause this. She had no seat at the table when the corporate income tax rate was raised or when the pension funding formula was negotiated. And the gap that Boeing's full departure leaves does not quietly disappear when the moving trucks pull away from West Fulton Market. It falls straight down onto the people who stayed. In my experience, damage of this kind moves in distinct layers. One headquarters closes. The corporate parent writes down its Chicago physical footprint and reassigns the supplier contracts to vendors in other regions. The city of Chicago loses by the projection of the Civic Federation, approximately $14 million in annual direct tax revenue from the building, its occupants, and their related spending, plus an estimated $31 million in indirect business tax receipts from the legal, accounting, and consulting firms that orbited the Boeing account. Cook County loses property tax revenue on a Class A commercial property whose vacancy rate just rose. The two restaurants on the ground floor of the tower, which together employ 41 people and built their lunch business around the Boeing tenancy, are now looking at a customer base that no longer exists. The local chapter of the United Way of Metropolitan Chicago, which counted Boeing as one of its 3 largest corporate donors, is now modeling a budget without that commitment. The Field Museum, the Art Institute, and the Lyric Opera, all of which had multi-year giving relationships with the company, are now adjusting their development projections. That is 3 full levels of damage from a single headquarters consolidation. Multiply that structure across the 8 confirmed major headquarters relocations out of Illinois since 2020, and you begin to understand the actual magnitude of what has happened to the state's corporate base. And Illinois is not running this experiment alone. That is the part I need you to hear clearly. New York lost a steady stream of financial firms to Florida and Texas through 2024 and 2025, with the Florida Department of Economic Opportunity reporting approximately $341 billion in cumulative financial firm assets relocated from New York to Florida since 2020. California lost its single largest corporate headquarters concentration in modern history when companies including Chevron, Tesla, Oracle, Hewlett-Packard Enterprise, and Charles Schwab all consolidated out of state. Minnesota's corporate income tax structure, which by 2026 was the 3rd highest in the country, has triggered quiet conversations among at least 4 Fortune 500 headquarters currently based in the Twin Cities. Connecticut watched General Electric leave Fairfield for Boston in 2016 and has spent the subsequent decade attempting to rebuild its corporate tax base. The same template, the same incentive structure, the same mathematically predictable outcome running on a slightly delayed timeline in each state. This is not 5 separate state-level stories. This is one national story about what happens when the incentive to leave becomes structurally more powerful than the incentive to stay. I have made a lot of investments over the course of 70 years of reading financial statements, and the single most important lesson I have learned across all of it is this. You cannot earn your way out of a structural mistake by hoping that the people most affected by it will not notice what you have done. They notice. They always notice. And when they have the means and the mobility to act on what they notice, they act, without exception, without sentiment, without waiting for permission. Illinois is now attempting to figure out how to replace a corporate base that has been quietly walking out the back door for the better part of a decade. The company that arrived in Chicago in 2001 with a mayor on the tarmac is now consolidating its corporate functions into a campus 15 miles from the Pentagon. Diane Kowalski is updating her resume for the first time in 19 years. The Civic Federation is modeling Cook County's 2028 budget around a property tax base that just lost a Class A anchor. And the governor who described the precise mechanism of this departure on a stage on South Michigan Avenue 35 days before the 8K was filed is preparing his next budget address. I stayed in Omaha my entire life because Omaha never gave me a reason to leave. That is the only reason any person or any business stays anywhere. Not loyalty, not habit, not the sentimental memory of a mayor at an airfield in 2001. The math. Change the math and you change the behavior every single time, without a single exception in the history of commerce. The money never sits still when you announce publicly where you intend to send it, and capital never stays in a place that has stopped making the arithmetic work. If you are watching this from a state where these conversations are just beginning, where the legislature is debating its own pension reform or its own corporate rate adjustment or its own commercial property tax restructuring, you are not watching Illinois' problem from a safe distance. You are watching your own situation playing out one election cycle ahead of you. If you have seen headquarters quietly trim their Chicago floors, neighbors stop talking about transfers they used to mention, or job postings simply stop appearing the way they once did, leave a comment below. Tell us what state you are in, what industry you work in, what you are actually seeing on the ground. Subscribe to this channel because this story is nowhere near finished. The numbers are still moving, and wherever the numbers go, the story follows. They always do.